The mountains have a way of keeping secrets. I've been working search and rescue in the Blue Ridge section of the Appalachians for 22 years now. Most folks picture search and rescue work as heroic rescues with grateful families and maybe the occasional unfortunate fatality. But they don't know about the other things, the cases that don't make the papers, the reports that get quietly filed away, the experiences that we don't talk about at the annual department cookout. My name is Morgan Caldwell. What I'm about to share with you are the cases that still keep me up at night. I'm not writing this for sympathy or attention. Consider it a warning. The mountains are beautiful, but they're also ancient and unforgiving. They don't care about your hiking plans or your Instagram photos. They've been here long before us, and they'll be here long after. My first truly disturbing case happened in 2005. A family of 4, the Whitakers, had gone camping in a remote section of the mountains. The father, Buford, mother Geneva, and their children, Silas and Mercy. They were experienced outdoors people who had been camping in these mountains for years. On their 3rd day, however, Mercy wandered away from their campsite while Geneva was cooking breakfast. The family searched for hours before calling it in. By the time that our team arrived, Mercy had been missing for nearly 7 hours. We organized a standard grid search radiating out from the last known position. I was paired with Deputy Sheriff Virgil Monroe, an old-timer who had been born and raised in these hills. As we swept our assigned sector, Virgil kept shaking his head. We ain't gonna find that little girl. Not in this part of the woods," he said, his voice low. "What makes you say that?" I asked, still relatively new to the job and the region. Virgil stopped, leaning on a gnarled hickory walking stick that he had carved himself. "This part of the mountains, it ain't right. Locals know better than to camp here, especially with youngins." I rolled my eyes thinking it was just local superstition, but Virgil was dead serious. "Back in the mining days, there was a collapse in the shaft that runs under this section. Trapped a bunch of men inside. Company said it was too dangerous to recover the bodies, so they sealed it up. Folks say that those miners still walk these woods, looking for children to take their place so that they can finally rest." I was about to dismiss his story when we had heard it, a child's laugh coming from deeper in the woods. We both took off running toward the sound. The terrain was rough, all steep slopes and dense undergrowth. The laugh came again, farther up ahead. We followed that sound for nearly 2 miles, far outside our assigned search grid. Eventually, we came to the mouth of a small cave, partially hidden by bushes. The opening was just big enough for a child to slip through, or a slender adult if they were determined. Virgil grabbed my arm when I moved toward it. "Don't go in there. That ain't natural." I shook him off. "If Mercy's in there, we need to get her out." The cave entrance opened into a narrow passage that forced me to crouch. The air inside was surprisingly cold and smelled of wet limestone and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing childish drawings scratched into the rock walls, stick figures holding hands, a house, the sun, and more disturbing images. Long, thin figures without faces, surrounding smaller figures that I assumed represented children. The passage eventually widened into a small chamber, and there, sitting cross-legged in the center, was Mercy Whitaker. She was humming softly to herself, seemingly unharmed. "Mercy," I called softly, trying not to startle her. She looked up, but not at me, at something behind me. "He said you'd come," she said matter-of-factly. "He said you would try to take me back, but I don't want to go. I like it here with my new friends." I turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty passage that I had come through. When I looked back at Mercy, she was standing, her small face suddenly angry. "They need me," she shouted. "The Hollow Men need me to help them find their way out." I approached her slowly, hands out in a non-threatening gesture. "Your mom and dad need you too, Mercy. They're very worried about you." She took a step back. "They shouldn't have brought me here. This place isn't for the living. That's what my friend said." I lunged forward and grabbed her before she could retreat deeper into the cave. She fought like a wild animal, scratching and biting, screaming words that no 6-year-old should know. It took all my strength to carry her thrashing body back through the passage. When we emerged into the sunlight, Virgil was waiting with a satellite phone, already calling in our position. Mercy went limp in my arms as soon as we had exited the cave, falling into what the paramedics would later call a dissociative state. The official report listed the incident as a case of a lost child suffering from dehydration and stress-induced hallucinations. It mentioned nothing about the drawings in the cave or the words that Mercy had spoken. The Whitakers had moved away from the area shortly after. I ran into Geneva at a gas station about a year later, and she told me that Mercy had no memory of what had happened during those hours that she was missing. But sometimes Geneva would find her daughter talking to empty corners of rooms, or drawing pictures of men with hollow eyes and long, thin limbs. "We don't camp anymore," Geneva told me, her voice brittle with forced cheerfulness. "Buford's taken up golf instead." In November 2009, a local hunter named Henry Eldrith went missing during the first week of deer season. Henry was 62, a lifelong resident who knew these mountains better than most game wardens. His wife reported him missing when he didn't return to their cabin by nightfall. When search and rescue was activated the next morning, I specifically requested to be on the team. I had known Henry for years. He had helped train some of our newer members on wilderness navigation and had even guided me to my first buck when I had moved to the area. What made his disappearance particularly concerning was that Henry had a very specific hunting routine. He would set up in the same deer stand, a platform that he had built in a large oak tree overlooking a natural funnel between two ridges, and he would stay there until dusk. He wasn't the type to go wandering off trail. We found his truck parked at his usual spot, a small pull-off on an old logging road. His rifle and pack were still in his deer stand, along with a thermos of coffee that was still warm when we found it. The only sign that something had gone wrong was a smear of blood on the wooden platform and drag marks leading away from the tree. The most obvious explanation was that Henry had shot a deer, climbed down to field dress it, and somehow gotten injured in the process. Perhaps he had fallen and hit his head or suffered a heart attack. But that didn't explain why he would have left his rifle behind, or why there was blood in the stand itself rather than on the ground below. We followed the drag marks, which headed straight downhill through dense mountain laurel thickets, away from any established trail. The blood sign was minimal, just occasional droplets rather than the heavy trail that you would expect from a serious injury. About half a mile from the deer stand, the drag marks and blood trail ended at the edge of a small and stagnant pond, what locals call a sinkhole, formed when underground limestone caves collapse and fill with water. The surface was coated with a film of brown duckweed, completely undisturbed. We set up a perimeter and called in the dive team from Johnson County. While waiting for them to arrive, I walked the circumference of the pond, looking for any sign that Henry might have pulled himself out and continued on. And that's when I noticed carvings on a nearby beech tree. Fresh carvings, the exposed wood still light-colored and leaking sap. They depicted a crude stick figure with a distended belly, surrounded by smaller figures that seemed to be bowing down to it. Below the carvings, someone had written, "The sink wants more." I called over our team's forensic photographer to document the carvings before showing the others. Something about them disturbed me deeply. particularly because the handwriting looked eerily similar to Henry's distinctive blocky letters. When the dive team arrived, they entered the sinkhole with underwater lights and cameras. The pond was deeper than it appeared, nearly 40 feet at its center with numerous underwater caves branching off from the main chamber. The divers found no sign of Henry, but what they did find wedged in one of the underwater caves were the skeletal remains of at least 3 other individuals. One set was identified through dental records as belonging to a hiker who had disappeared back in 1998. The other 2 were too degraded for identification. The case took an even stranger turn 3 days later when a trail camera belonging to another hunter captured an image of what appeared to be Henry walking through the forest about 2 miles from where he had gone missing. The photo was taken at night, the infrared flash giving it a ghostly quality. The figure was clearly Henry, wearing the same flannel jacket and orange cap that he had had on when he disappeared, but something was wrong with his eyes. They reflected the camera's flash with an unusual triangular pupil shape, similar to a goat's. The search was redirected to that area, but no further sign of Henry was found. Weeks turned to months, and eventually his case was classified as a presumed wilderness fatality, though no body was ever recovered. A year to the day after Henry vanished, his wife Mabel called me in a panic. Somebody had been outside their cabin in the middle of the night, tapping on the windows and calling her name in Henry's voice. When she looked outside, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. "It looked like Henry," she told me, her voice shaking, "but all swollen up, like he had been in water for a long time. And his eyes," she trailed off. "What about his eyes?" "They weren't human. And he kept pointing back towards the woods like he wanted me to follow him." I drove out to check on her, but found nothing unusual around the property. I convinced myself it was just the grief and stress playing tricks on the elderly widow's mind. 2 days later, though, Mabel Eldrith disappeared. Her cabin was found undisturbed, dinner still warm on the stove, her reading glasses next to her favorite chair, the door locked from the inside. The only unusual detail was a trail of water on the floor, leading from the bathroom to the back door. Despite an extensive search, Mabel was never found. I still avoid that part of the forest. Sometimes during heavy rain, I think about that sinkhole, steadily filling with water from hidden underground streams, and I wonder what else might be down there in those lightless caves, waiting. In the summer of 2013, we received a call about 3 college students who had gone hiking and failed to return to their car by nightfall. They had planned a day hike to photograph the sunset from Lookout Point, a popular scenic overlook. By the time we mobilized the next morning, the students had been missing for nearly 18 hours. The weather had been clear, but temperatures at that elevation could drop significantly at night, raising concerns about hypothermia. We found their vehicle at the trailhead parking lot and began following the main trail. Everything seemed normal until we had reached a fork about 2 miles in. The left path continued toward Lookout Point, our assumed destination, while the right path led to what locals called Preacher's Ridge, a less traveled way named after an evangelical minister who had supposedly performed baptisms in a small stream there in the 1800s. What caught our attention was a pile of rocks at the fork, topped with a small handmade doll fashioned from twigs and twine. The doll had no face, just a blank space where the features should be. This wasn't a standard trail marking, and something about it felt off. On a hunch, I examined the ground around the fork and found fresh boot prints heading toward Preacher's Ridge rather than Lookout Point. We redirected our search accordingly. Preacher's Ridge was heavily overgrown, the trail barely visible in some places. As we climbed higher, the forest changed character. The usual mix of oak and hickory giving way to gnarled pines and ancient vines that formed a dense canopy overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. About a mile up this trail, we found a single hiking boot, identified later as belonging to one of the students, Aidan McNair. We continued climbing, finding occasional disturbing signs. A camera lens cap, a torn backpack strap, a water bottle with dark smudges that testing would later confirm as blood, but no clear trail indicating where the students had gone. Near the summit of the ridge, we came upon a small clearing with a large fire pit containing the ashes of a recent fire in the middle, and scattered around that fire pit were Polaroid photos. I still remember the sick feeling in my stomach as I picked up those photos. Each one showed one of the missing students. In the first set, they were smiling, posing against the backdrop of the forest. Normal vacation shots. But each subsequent photograph showed them looking increasingly distressed. In the final images, they were bound to trees with vines and rope, their faces contorted in terror. And standing behind them, partially obscured by shadow, was a tall figure wearing what appeared to be a deer skull as a mask. We immediately called for backup, including armed sheriff's deputies. While waiting, we conducted a careful search of the area and found a narrow path leading away from the fire pit toward the eastern face of the ridge. The path ended at the entrance to a small cave. The ground outside was disturbed with clear signs of a struggle, and inside we found more disturbing evidence. A smashed cell phone and walls lined with hundreds of twig dolls similar to the one that we had found at the trail fork. There was no sign of the students themselves until we had ventured deeper into the cave. In a small chamber at the back, illuminated by a shaft of light from a crack in the ceiling, we found 3 sets of clothes, neatly folded and stacked in separate piles, each topped with a driver's license. Aiden's, Delilah's, and Jasper's, the college students. The clothes showed no signs of violence, no tears or bloodstains. It was as if the students had simply stepped out of them and walked away. A thorough search of the surrounding area yielded nothing. No bodies, no further trails, no indication of where they might have gone. It was as if they had simply vanished from inside that cave. The investigation took a bizarre turn when authorities ran background checks on the missing students. They discovered that all 3 had been active on an online forum dedicated to local folklore and occult practices. In the weeks before their disappearance, they had posted extensively about something that they called the Faceless Shepherd of Preacher's Ridge. According to their research, the original preacher for whom the ridge was named had not been a Christian minister at all, but the leader of a small secretive cult that practiced rituals aimed at communicating with an entity they described as the Watcher in the Woods. The cult had allegedly disappeared during a harsh winter in 1879, with locals claiming that they had walked into the hills and never returned. The students appeared to have been attempting to recreate one of these rituals. Their final forum post made the day before their hike read, "Tomorrow we meet the shepherd. If the old accounts are true, he will take our faces and give us new ones. We will become part of the watching woods." And despite one of the largest search operations in county history involving multiple agencies and lasting nearly 3 weeks, no trace of the students were ever found. The case remained open but inactive until October of the following year, when a local resident stated that he saw 3 figures standing motionless among the trees on his property near Preacher's Ridge. They were unclothed, their skin pale to the point of translucence, their heads tilted at identical unnatural angles. Where their faces should have been were only smooth, blank expanses of skin. The resident who sent in the call was often known to cry wolf, and authorities officially dismissed it as a hoax when they went and swept the property, finding nothing. But I swear sometimes when I'm working in that part of the forest, I feel like I'm being watched by eyes that I cannot see. Not all of my disturbing experiences involve missing persons. Sometimes we find exactly who we're looking for and wish that we hadn't. In February of 2016, we were called to assist in a wellness check at a remote cabin on the outskirts of Boone County. The resident, Cordell Leadbetter, was an elderly recluse who hadn't been seen in town for several weeks. A distant relative had requested the check after his phone went unanswered for days. The cabin was located at the end of a long dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. Recent snow and ice storms had made it impassable by vehicle, forcing us to hike the last mile in on foot. From the outside, the cabin appeared abandoned. Windows were dark and snow had piled undisturbed on the porch. The local deputy who had come along with me knocked repeatedly while announcing police presence but received no response. When we entered, the interior was freezing, the wood stove long gone cold. A layer of dust covered most surfaces, suggesting Leadbetter hadn't been active in the main living area for some time. However, there were no signs of struggle or foul play. Maybe you went to stay with somebody for the winter, I suggested, though we all knew Leadbetter was notorious for refusing to leave his property under any circumstances. We were about to depart when the deputy noticed something odd about the kitchen floor. A small braided rug had been partially moved aside, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a trapdoor. And did anybody know that Leadbetter had a cellar? He asked. None of us had heard of one. The cabin was over 100 years old, built by Leadbetter's grandfather, and modifications were common in such structures. Still though, something about the partially revealed door made my skin crawl. The deputy pulled the rug away completely and found an iron ring set into the wooden door. When he pulled, the door opened with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a set of crude steps descending into the darkness. The smell that rose from below was immediate and overwhelming, a putrid mix of decay, urine, and something else. Something chemical and sharp that burned the nostrils. Christ almighty, the deputy muttered, stepping back and covering his nose with the sleeve. Protocol dictated that we investigate, despite every instinct telling us to close that door and walk away. The deputy went first, a flashlight in one hand and a weapon in the other. I followed close behind. The cellar was larger than I expected, extending well beyond the footprint of the cabin above. The ceiling was low, forcing us to stoop, and the earthen floor was damp and uneven. Our flashlight beams revealed rough stone walls covered in what looked like streaks of dried blood. But it was what we found at the far end of the cellar that haunts me still. A metal bed frame had been bolted to the floor, fitted with leather restraints at the corners. Beside it stood a crude workbench littered with tools, scalpels, bone saws, needles, and jars containing preserved specimens. I couldn't immediately identify them. And hanging from hooks in the ceiling were what appeared at first glance to be animal hides. It took several moments for my brain to process what I was actually seeing. Human skins, carefully preserved and stretched, at least 6 complete specimens. At the center of this grotesque workshop sat Cordell Leadbetter in a hand-carved wooden chair. He was very much alive, though severely emaciated. His eyes, when they caught our flashlight beams, showed no surprise or shame, only annoyance at the interruption. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "This is family business." "What is this place, Leadbetter?" the deputy demanded, his weapon now trained directly on the old man. Leadbetter smiled, revealing black teeth. "Oh, just continuing the work my daddy taught me and his daddy before him. The hollow men need new skins when the old ones wear out." Before the deputy could respond, Leadbetter lunged with unexpected speed, driving something sharp toward the deputy's midsection. He fired twice, the gunshots deafening in the confined space. Leadbetter collapsed, the crude bone knife he had been holding clattering to the floor. As he lay there dying, he kept smiling with that terrible smile. "Too late," he whispered. "They already have your scent now. They'll come looking for you when they get hungry again." And those were his last words. The subsequent investigation revealed horrors beyond imagination. Over the past 40 years at least, 26 hikers and campers had disappeared within a 50-mile radius of Leadbetter's cabin. In a hidden room accessible only through a narrow crawl space at the back of the cellar, investigators found personal effects belonging to at least 11 of these missing persons. They also found journals, dozens of them dating back to the 1850s, all written by Leadbetter men. The accounts detailed a family tradition of providing vessels for entities they called the Hollow Men, supposedly ancient spirits that lived in the deepest caves of these mountains and required human bodies to interact with the surface world. The process, described in meticulous and stomach-turning detail, involved capturing victims, keeping them alive while systematically removing their skin, and then preserving that skin through a combination of chemical treatments and occult rituals. What the journals didn't explain was what happened to the skinless bodies afterward, or why none were found on the property despite decades of this grotesque practice. Most disturbing of all was the final entry in Cordell Leadbetter's journal, dated just 3 days before our arrival. February 17th. They're getting impatient. Say the vessels don't last like they used to. Need fresher skins, younger ones. Promise them the next search party that comes looking. They always send search parties eventually. I requested a transfer shortly after the Leadbetter case had concluded. My superiors denied it, citing my experience and knowledge to the region as too valuable to lose. But sometimes I wonder if there was another reason, if perhaps they needed someone who already knew too much to stay right where they were. In October 2019, a dense fog settled over the western slopes of the mountains and didn't lift for nearly a week. This wasn't unusual for the season, but what happened during that fog certainly was. It began with a routine call. An elderly couple, the Vances, had gone missing from their small farm near the edge of Cherokee National Forest. According to their daughter, they had called her the previous evening, sounding confused and claiming that people were walking in the fog outside of their home. When the daughter drove to check on them the next morning, the house was empty. The front door stood open, breakfast half prepared on the kitchen table. Their truck was still in the driveway, keys hanging on the hook by the door. Initial assumptions leaned toward the couple experiencing confusion. Both were in their late 70s and wandering into the nearby woods. But as our team began the search, something felt off from the start. The fog was oppressive, limiting visibility to less than 20 feet. Sounds behaved strangely in it. Voices seemed to come from the wrong directions, and several times team members reported hearing their names called by voices that didn't belong to anybody in our group. I was working with a new recruit, Nicole Goggins, a local who had recently returned after a stint in the military. As we swept through the field behind the Vance property, Nicole suddenly grabbed my arm. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing into the mist. About 50 feet ahead, barely visible through the swirling fog, was a figure standing motionless. It appeared to be watching us. "Hello?" I called out. "This is search and rescue. We're looking for Eustace and Dorothy Vance." The figure didn't respond or move. As we cautiously approached, it seemed to recede, maintaining the same distance regardless of how quickly we advanced. "It's leading us somewhere," Nicole murmured. I was about to argue when my radio crackled with static and then fell silent. Attempting to call the rest of the team yielded no response. We were effectively cut off. The logical course would have been to turn back, but something compelled us to follow that silent figure deeper into the fog. It led us through the field across a small stream and into the edge of the forest beyond the Vance property. We walked for what felt like hours, though my watch showed only 20 minutes had passed. The forest around us grew increasingly unfamiliar. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the fog revealed a tall stone structure similar to an obelisk. The figure that we had been following now stood underneath it. As we approached, the fog swirled and parted just enough for me to see that it wasn't a person at all, but a roughly human-shaped mass of twigs and branches bound together with what looked like human hair. "What the heck?" I muttered, instinctively reaching for my sidearm. "Morgan, look," Nicole whispered, pointing beyond the obelisk. Through gaps in the fog, I could make out more figures, dozens of them standing motionless among the trees surrounding the structure. Some appeared to be normal humans, while others were clearly constructed like the one that had led us here. And moving among them were two familiar shapes, Eustace and Dorothy Vance. They walked with strange, puppet-like movements, their eyes vacant and their expressions blank. Behind them, partially obscured by fog, loomed a much larger figure that seemed to be manipulating them, with thin strands that caught the light like spider silk. I raised my flashlight, trying to get a better look at this controlling entity, but Nicole knocked my arm down. "Don't," she hissed. "My grandmother used to talk about this. The fog people, if they know you can see them, they take you too." Before I could respond, a voice called out from behind us, the clear professional shout of another search and rescue officer. The fog people immediately retreated, including the Vances, vanishing into the mist between one blink and the next. Moments later, two of our team members emerged from the fog, explaining that they had been searching for us for nearly an hour after we had failed to respond to the radio calls. According to them, we had somehow wandered almost 2 miles off our assigned search grid. The official search for the Vances continued for another week without success. Their disappearance was eventually attributed to confusion followed by exposure in the harsh weather conditions. But only a few days later, one of our search and rescue team members discovered something about 5 miles off the Vance property. 2 crude effigies made of twigs and branches, bound with human hair, later confirmed to belong to the Vances. The effigies had been carefully arranged, sitting side by side on a fallen log, facing towards the mountains. Most disturbing of all, when the figures were moved, park rangers discovered that the log beneath them had been carefully hollowed out. Inside were human teeth, a complete set from 2 different individuals. I never told anybody else what Nicole and I saw in the fog that day, and Nicole herself left the search and rescue team shortly afterward, moving to Arizona where, as she put it, you can see for miles in every direction. Technology has changed search and rescue operations dramatically over the years, mostly for the better. Drones, GPS tracking, infrared cameras, all valuable tools that have helped save lives. But sometimes, technology reveals things that we might be better off not seeing. In spring 2022, a professional wildlife photographer named Julian Kincaid went missing while documenting the annual firefly display in a remote section of the Great Smoky Mountains. This rare natural phenomenon, where thousands of fireflies blink in unison, attracts photographers from around the world during the 2-week period when it occurs. Kincaid had permits to be in a restricted area after dark, and park rangers became concerned when he failed to return to his designated parking area by morning. His campsite was found undisturbed, his equipment still set up, including a sophisticated camera trap designed to capture time-lapse images of the fireflies throughout the night. Our team was called in when initial searches by park rangers found no sign of Kincaid on any of the established trails. I was interested in the case because the area where he had disappeared was one that I knew well, a section of old-growth forest that had always felt slightly off to me, though I had never experienced anything overtly supernatural there. When we arrived at the campsite, everything looked normal. His tent was properly secured, his sleeping bag laid out inside. The camera trap was still operational, set up on a tripod facing a small clearing where fireflies were known to congregate. The memory card showed that it had captured images throughout the night, taking one shot every 30 seconds from dusk until dawn. While the rest of the team began a standard search pattern, I stayed behind to review the camera's footage, hoping that it might provide clues to where Kincaid had went. The first few hours of images showed nothing unusual, just the gradual darkening of the forest as night fell, occasionally illuminated by the flashing of fireflies. Kincaid himself appeared in a few frames, making adjustments to the camera. But at around 1:30 in the morning, something changed. The firefly activity suddenly ceased, as if something had startled them. And at the edge of the frame, barely visible, a pale figure seemed to be watching from behind a tree. In subsequent images, the figure moved gradually closer to the center of the clearing. It was humanoid but wrong somehow. Too tall and thin, its proportions subtly distorted. Its face, when it finally turned toward the camera, appeared to be not a face at all but a shifting mass of light that mimicked facial features without quite achieving them. At 2:17, Kincaid entered the frame again. He appeared to be looking directly at the entity, though his back was to the camera. He extended his hand as if in greeting or perhaps to touch the thing. The next image showed only empty forest. Both Kincaid and the entity had vanished. The remaining photos captured nothing unusual until dawn broke. Just an empty clearing occasionally illuminated by the flashlights of the first park rangers to arrive at the scene. I downloaded the images to my phone and caught up with the rest of the team, showing them what I had found. Most were skeptical, suggesting lens flare or light pollution from distant sources could explain the strange figure. The search continued for 3 days with no sign of Julian. No blood, no clothing, no trail indicating which direction he might have gone in. It was as if he had simply stepped out of our reality. On the 4th day, as we were preparing to scale back the operation, I made a discovery that still gives me nightmares. In a small ravine about a half-mile from the campsite, I found Kincaid's notebook. The final entry, timestamped at 2:15 a.m. on the night he disappeared, read, "I can see them now. The light creatures, they've been here all along, hiding in the patterns of the fireflies. They say they can show me how to photograph the spaces between moments. All I have to do is follow them into the light." Below this was a crude drawing that matched the entity captured by the camera trap. As I was reading, my phone suddenly began cycling through the images that I had downloaded from Kincaid's camera, though I hadn't touched it. It stopped on the 2:17 a.m. image, the last one showing Kincaid and the entity. And as I watched, horrified, the image zoomed in on its own, focusing on the entity's face. The shifting lights resolved into recognizable features for just a moment, features that belonged to Julian Kincaid. And then the screen went black. The battery completely drained despite having been at 90% moments before. Julian was never found. His case remains open, classified as a suspected wilderness accident or an animal attack. His camera, which I personally turned over to park rangers, was reported missing from the evidence locker a week later. The backup copies of the images which had been uploaded to the investigation database were corrupted beyond recovery. My final and perhaps most disturbing case began as a routine operation in January of 2023. A historic hunting lodge on private property near the Tennessee border had been renovated as a boutique retreat center for corporate executives. During their first winter event, a leadership summit for technology, 3 attendees vanished overnight. The lodge's manager, Bart Quillen, reported that the missing persons were all part of the company, the CFO, VP, and Director of Operations. They had been present at dinner but failed to appear for breakfast the following morning. Their room showed no signs of disturbance. Personal items, including phones and wallets, were still in place. Initial assumptions leaned toward the executives having gone for an early morning hike despite warnings about the harsh weather conditions. The property backed up to thousands of acres of wilderness, with several unmarked trails leading into the national forest. When I arrived with my team, a light snow was falling, quickly covering any tracks that might have been left. The temperature had dropped to the low teens overnight, making exposure a serious concern if the executives were indeed outdoors. The lodge itself was an impressive structure built in the 1890s by a lumber baron named Obin Prescott, and it featured mounted trophies from a century of different hunting expeditions. The renovations had added modern amenities while preserving the rustic character that made the place both charming and slightly unnerving. Bart gave us a tour of the property, explaining that the lodge had been abandoned for nearly 30 years before he had purchased it 3 years ago. Now the locals were superstitious about it, he said with a dismissive wave. Something about Prescott's hunting practices, claimed that he didn't hunt animals. When I pressed him on this, he shrugged. Oh, mountain folklore. Prescott supposedly had a taste for exotic game, whatever that meant. The stories say he kept trophies from human victims in a hidden room somewhere in the lodge, but we've renovated every inch of the place and never found anything like that. We organized a standard search pattern focusing first on the marked trails leading from the lodge into the surrounding forest. Meanwhile, I interviewed the remaining executives and staff members about the previous evening. A consistent detail emerged. During dinner, the CFO, Tamara, had mentioned finding a hidden door behind a bookcase in the library. A real-life secret passage, as she had described it. According to witnesses, she had been excited about exploring it further after dinner, and had invited Gregory, the VP, and Lucinda, the director, to join her. When I had asked Bart about this hidden door, he seemed very confused. There's no hidden door in the library. We gutted that room down to the studs during renovation. I decided to inspect the library myself. It was a handsome room lined with built-in bookshelves and dominated by a stone fireplace. A careful examination of the shelving revealed nothing unusual until I noticed something odd about the pattern of the wooden floorboards near the eastern wall. They were slightly newer than the surrounding wood, as if that section had been replaced more recently. I ran my hands along the bookshelf covering that wall, feeling for any irregularities. Near the bottom shelf, my fingers caught on a small metal lever disguised as a decorative book. When pulled, it released a catch, and a section of the bookcase swung inward with surprising smoothness. Behind it, a passage carved directly into the stone foundation of the lodge. The air that wafted out was cold and damp, with an unpleasant musty odor that reminded me of neglected root cellars and forgotten tombs. I called for backup before entering, now wanting to repeat the mistakes of the missing executives. 2 of my team members arrived with powerful flashlights and weapons drawn, standard protocol when entering unknown enclosed spaces during a search. The passage descended via rough stone steps that looked much older than the lodge itself, as if the building had been constructed around a pre-existing structure. The walls were damp with seeping groundwater, and occasional niches had been carved into them, each containing small, peculiar objects, twisted metal shapes, bundles of dried herbs tied with human hair, and what appeared to be very old small bones. After descending about 30 feet, the passage opened into a large chamber that immediately set my nerves on edge. Unlike the crude passage, this room had been finished with dressed stone and elaborate carvings. The ceiling arched overhead, supported by columns inscribed with symbols I didn't recognize but instinctively disliked. In the center of the chamber stood a large stone table, its surface stained dark brown in a way that suggested centuries of spilled blood. Surrounding it were 13 high-backed wooden chairs arranged in a perfect oval. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each chair featured intricate carvings of elongated human figures engaged in what appeared to be hunting activities, though their prey was deliberately obscured. Most disturbing were the trophies mounted on the walls. Dozens of taxidermied heads, many recognizably animal, deer, bear, mountain lion, but others more ambiguous. They had been altered or combined in ways that made classification impossible, Creatures with too many eyes or misplaced features, or anatomical structures that had no natural counterpart, and occupying 3 of the chairs sitting perfectly upright with vacant expressions, were Tamara, Gregory, and Lucinda. "Hello?" I called cautiously, approaching with my flashlight beam directed at their faces. "Are you all right?" None responded or showed any sign of registering my presence. Their eyes were open but unfocused, pupils dilated despite the bright light. They breathed shallowly and had pulses when I checked, but appeared to be in some kind of trance or a catatonic state. As we prepared to move them, I noticed something on the stone altar. A leather-bound book open to a page filled with handwritten text in faded brown ink. The language was not English, but scattered throughout were diagrams of human figures with their heads replaced by various animals. One of my team members began to read aloud from the text, stumbling over the strange syllables. I immediately slapped the book closed, remembering too many folktales about the danger of reading unknown incantations. "Let's get these people out of here first," I said firmly. "Then we can figure out what happened." As we turned to help the executives, the door that we had entered through suddenly swung shut with a definitive boom that echoed throughout the chamber. At the same moment, the 3 executives rose in perfect unison, their movements mechanical and unnatural. "The gathering is not complete," they said in perfect unison, their voices flat and emotionless. "The Prescott hunt requires 13. You will stay." One of my team members drew his sidearm, but before he could speak, something heavy struck the back of my head. As consciousness faded, I caught a glimpse of Bart standing over me, holding what looked like an antique hunting club. "Sorry about this," he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "But my family traditions must be maintained. My grandfather would be so disappointed if we didn't continue the hunt." I awoke what seemed like hours later, my hands and feet bound to one of the ornate chairs. My team members were restrained nearby. The executives remained seated in their chairs, still in that unnerving trance state. 7 more chairs had been filled with lodge staff members, all wearing the same vacant expression. Bart stood by the altar, now dressed in an outdated hunting outfit that might have been fashionable in the 1800s. He was reading from a leather book, his voice rising and falling in a chanting cadence that made my skin crawl. "The traditional Prescott hunt has always required 13 participants," he explained conversationally during a pause in his chanting. "9 to serve as vessels for the Ancient Ones, 3 to serve as quarry, and 1 to serve as master of the hunt." He gestured to these strange trophies on the walls. "My great-grandfather discovered that certain entities from the deeper woods would exchange their essence, their power, for the experience of hunting in human form. They take temporary possession of willing vessels to participate in the hunt. Those people don't look willing," I managed to say through a mouth that felt stuffed with cotton, and Bart smiled. "A simple potion and their evening brandy was all it took to make them receptive. They've been prepared as vessels. You and your colleagues, however, will serve as quarry." He returned to his chanting, and I watched in horror as something began to happen to the seated figures. Their features seemed to ripple and distort as if something else was pushing outward from inside them. Their skin stretched and reformed, taking on characteristics of the mounted trophies on the walls. Antlers sprouting from temples, eyes multiplying or changing shape, teeth elongating into fangs or tusks. I struggled against my bonds, the rough rope cutting into my wrists. Beside me, my team member Rod had managed to work one hand partially free and was fumbling with something in his pocket. Just as Bart reached what seemed to be the climax of his chant, Rod broke free and lunged at him, revealing what he had been reaching for: a road flare from his emergency kit. He struck it against the stone altar in the chamber filled with harsh red light and caustic smoke. The effect on the transforming figures was immediate and dramatic. They recoiled from the light, their partially altered forms spasming as if in pain. Bart shouted in a language that I didn't understand, trying to continue the ritual, but the damage had been done. In the confusion, I managed to tip my chair over, breaking it against the stone floor. The ancient wood, despite its elaborate craftsmanship, was brittle with age and shattered on impact. I freed myself from the ropes and helped release my other teammate. What followed was chaos. The entities that had been emerging through the bodies of the lodge occupants were now caught in a halfway state, neither fully manifested nor fully retreated. They stumbled about the chamber, howling in voices that contained both human pain and inhuman rage. Bart had produced an antique hunting rifle and was trying to restore order, shouting phrases from the book. I tackled him to the ground, sending the rifle skittering across the stone floor. "You fool," he spat, struggling beneath me. "The ritual can't be interrupted at this stage. You've doomed us all." Before I could respond, one of the partially transformed creatures, I think it had been Tamara, grabbed Bart and lifted him effortlessly into the air. Her face had elongated into something resembling a deer's snout, but with rows of shark-like teeth that had no place on an herbivore. What happened next is something that I've tried to forget. The transformed lodge occupants, driven mad by their incomplete metamorphosis, turned on Bart and then on each other. The chamber became a battleground as creatures with impossible forms tore at each other with claws and teeth that shouldn't exist in nature. My team and I retreated toward the door, which had swung open when the ritual had been disrupted. As we backed up the staircase, I saw Bart's body being dismembered by the very entities that he had sought to bind to his service. We managed to escape the lodge and call for backup. By the time that additional forces arrived, the building was engulfed in flames. We never determined the exact cause of the fire. Perhaps Rod's flare had ignited something, or perhaps these supernatural energies unleashed by the interrupted ritual had combusted on their own. The official report listed the incident as a tragic accident. Obviously, somewhat fishy in hindsight, but things have a way of being covered up around these parts. So yeah, that's all that I have for now. I don't expect everybody to believe these accounts. Most days, I'm not sure I believe them myself. But I do know that this part of the country is very old. It holds secrets that defy conventional explanation. Pockets of strangeness where the normal rules seem to fray around the edges. Damon McGorry, Big Country Allen, Leon Knott, Meat Gesher, Rain, That One Woodsman, Army of Meerkats, Sendos Adrian, SWAT, Taki Delay, Raphael, Smiling Cat, Dragon Slayer 048, Ty Screaming, Malcolm Black, Sleepy Shroomy, Nelson Asana, Sanjay Anthem, Talamagara, Jimmy Griffin, Caden Gibbler, Kathy McGuire, MP Massacre 91, Justin Fotenauer, Dino, Takio Zerla, Deggy, Jerry Ramey, Miss Eldridge, Goonology.